All right. Well, I hope everybody had an opportunity to get a nice lunch, and now we're probably all ready to sit back in our postprandial uh, sleepiness as we carry into the afternoon. But I think our speakers this afternoon will definitely keep us going and keep us wide awake. So, what we're going to venture into now is, I guess, what I defined as the end users, is those that, I want to say, are down in the trenches that are trying to put these together, these performance standards together, and try them out and test them. And what is their perspective in how they approach these? What are the things they look out for? And what maybe has worked and what maybe has not? And trying to give us the impetus as end users to really get that push forward and move forward, getting these developed and implemented at our own institutions. So our first speaker for this afternoon is Dr. Neil Lipman. Dr. Lipman is the Executive Director of the Center of Comparative Medicine Pathology, which serves both the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center as well as the Weill Medical College of Cornell University. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Lipman.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon. So I've been selected to give you the perspective from the academic side of the situation. And let me tell you what I'm going to try to cover in the time that was allotted to me today. First of all, I'm going to talk about our program because academic programs are quite variable and they can be quite different. And it's important to understand where we're coming from. I'm going to give you my perspective, and again, much of this is my opinion, and you can take that for what it's worth. Most people don't take it for much. So I'm going to give you what I consider the advantages and disadvantages of both. I'm going to talk about how we approach standard development. I'm going to use two examples of standards that we developed. And I'm going to just broach the subject of what do you do when the standards, the performance standard, actually conflicts with the engineering standard. Don't have an answer for that. And then maybe think about looking forward. So first of all, and my colleagues will probably agree that are in academia, there's no typical academic program. Although we respect one another, we typically disagree with one another as often as we agree. So this is our program, and our program is a little unique in that it's bi-institutional. I support two separate and distinct institutions. I have two bosses, two budgets, and we have two Aia Codes. Now, it's not as bad as it sounds. We're actually quite a large program. We're about 250,000 animals on our campuses any day, and that's comprised about over 50,000 rodent boxes. And we're staffed with about 250 people. Why is this important? And it's because it gives us resources that perhaps smaller institutions don't have. We're not only located in New York City, but we're located in some of the peripheral areas of New York, as well as we have a facility in Doha, Qatar. We're a very mouse-centric program, as many programs are. One thing we do is our program is very highly harmonized. If you go to any of our facilities, for the most part, we try to do things exactly the same. We have two other resources that I think are very important from the standpoint of performance standard development. We have a relatively large multidisciplinary anatomic and clinical path lab. It gives us the ability to do certain types of testing that may be beneficial in developing a standard. And we also have a human resource in that we have a postgraduate training program, and these fellows provide the human component to do some of the work that needs to be done from the perspective of developing a performance standard. So again, these are my opinions as far as the advantages and disadvantages of both engineering, and then we'll talk about a performance standard. So, and you've heard this morning as well, it ensures a minimal standard, the floor. I'm not sure all standards are the floor, and perhaps there's the ability to go down to the cellar and still provide good animal care and welfare. But in general, we think about them as the floor. And I personally believe they're necessary. I would not want to see the world without some engineering standards. It allows for standardization, at least some standardization in the industry. And it provides a certain level of consistency that otherwise may not exist. Ideally, and you've heard this morning as well, is that they should ideally be based on objective and scientific data. That's not always the case. They're also easier to implement with respect to performance standards. It's black and white. You know what you need to do. There's not a lot of guesswork. And I'm not saying that when I talk about them being less costly, they're less costly in that you don't have to invest time in developing the standard as you do with a performance standard. A performance standard. Now, what are some of the disadvantages? And I think they're significant. It can be empirical, and very often I think they're anthropomorphic, and they can be influenced by politics rather than sound information. They're highly problematic if they're based on poor data. If they're very tightly defined, I think they're process restrictive and actually can retard the development of new knowledge. They're also, and this was mentioned earlier today, they're also much more difficult to change, and sometimes they're quite inflexible. They can result in unnecessary costs, especially if they're not well prescribed. And sometimes, not always, there's a lack of transparency, so you don't understand how they were developed. Now, if we contrast that with a performance standard and look at their advantages, and again, much of this other people have said or said in a similar way, is they allow greater flexibility. They're not static. They can be changed over time. I believe they improve animal welfare and care. They can be tailored to an individual situation or to an individual institution. And they can result in refinement and improvement of engineering standards. There is a link between them, and I think that's very important to understand. The disadvantages are to do it right is really a cost and timely proposition. And that is really one of the big challenges that are associated with it. Again, it could be subjective, and subjectivity is not always a positive thing. And you may have people that are going to have different views on what the desired outcomes are. That can be positive or negative. Sometimes it's very difficult to determine what to measure, depending on what the standard is. And it can also be very challenging for institutions or programs that are resource limited. So let me talk about our institution, and I'm going to reframe this a little bit and think about this the way I would think about it. I don't go around saying, well, we're going to develop performance standards. We have a culture within our organization of evidence-based or outcome-driven decision-making and problem-solving, and that's really what it's about. It's making decisions based on information. And this is, hopefully, this permeates within our organization, among our team, to approach problems this way. Although obviously we adhere to engineering standards, we don't promulgate it, we don't emphasize them as part of our daily operations. Our operations are more goal-oriented. We do hypothesis and data-driven management whenever possible. We try to recognize bias, and it does exist within any organization, and try to manage it. In our decision-making, we try to be as objective as possible. And we also try to be transparent among our staff as well as the investigative staff, so they understand where this came from and the approach we took to making decisions. And I think this is very important. Pat mentioned this morning. I think outcome sharing is very, very important in publication. It allows it to be your decisions or your process to stand up to scrutiny, and it also allows it to be shared by others that can use it. As I prepared for this talk, I tried to think about how to convey certain things. And so we have three primary program drivers. And this influences much of what we do day to day in operating our program. And it also directly influences any standards we would develop, which is one of our primary goals, and it's the pinnacle of the triangle, is animal health and welfare. It's very, very important. We're there to support science, and we can't forget that. And many of these things work in concert. We're a service organization, and we have to offer high-quality customer service. So these three things should be paramount as a desired outcome in any performance standard that we develop. So I'm going to give you two examples. The first one has to do with identifying pre-weanling mice. As I said, we're a very mouse-centric program. And ideally identifying them in a way in which at the same time we can collect tissue for genotyping. The reality is there are limited methods available to reliably and permanently identify pre-weanling mice. And we have historically used toe clipping at our institution. But most of you recognize that there are strong anthropomorphic views on this, and many feel that this technique is not humane. And as an example, there was a publication out of the UK, a joint working group on refinement and production of genetically engineered mice. It was published in 2003, and I highlighted a couple of take-home points from that publication. It should not be routinely used. It is assumed, and I'm emphasizing assumed, to cause pain and impact the animal's ability to grip. It should be used as a last resort method, and it should be performed under local anesthesia. The reality is, prior to 2010, there was very little objective data in the literature. And actually, I served on the committee to revise the guide. It was about the time we were working on the guide that two publications came out of Europe that started to shed additional light on this topic. And if you contrast the 7th edition of the guide with the 3rd edition, the 8th edition of the guide, there was some references to these papers, and it did indicate that it may be the preferred method for neonatal mice up to 7 days of age, as it appears to have few adverse effects on behavior and well-being at this age. But the reality is this is the upper limit at which these studies operated, which these studies were done. They didn't look at animals older than postnatal day 7. I think the reason for that was that it was believed that after postnatal day 7, the phalanges are calcified, and clipping or cutting a calcified digit would be more painful. And so that was sort of the limit. And the reality is, very often you need to identify animals older than that age. And there are other studies that have been done when you talk about tail biopsying and you need to genotype, that in fact, older animals less than postnatal day 17 are preferred. So we elected to look at this. And the reality is, I'm not sure what our intent was, and we can discuss this, whether we looked at postnatal day 7 in the guide to be an engineering standard. But my sense is anytime you put a number on something, it sort of tends to become an engineering standard. And so we felt the obligation and the duty to look at this further to determine what should be done. So here is our approach. We had desired outcomes, and many of these should be quite obvious. We want to minimize pain and distress. We want to limit both short and long-term physiologic and behavioral effects. We want it to be safe and easy for the operator. We want it to be permanent. We needed a unique number to be assigned to a large number of animals. Again, this is used primarily for genetically engineered animals that we're breeding and crossing and needing to identify uniquely. We also wanted to have the option of biopsying these animals simultaneously for obtaining tissue from their tail for either PCR or for southern blots. And ideally, it would be cost effective. So we elected to do a study and evaluate this, and we looked at 4 groups of animals. We looked at 2 that were toe clipped, one without a topical anesthetic and one with. The topical anesthetic was a vapocoolant ethyl chloride. And then we had 2 sham groups in which no anesthesia was used, and one in which the topical vapocoolant was used. We used a strain of mouse that is most common background strain in genetically engineered animals. An experienced technician did this work. We clipped 2 toes, the third digit on the front and the opposing 3rd digit on the rear. And then we did a certain amount of evaluation. So these pups were observed for immediate reaction at days immediately after, and 1, 3, 5, and 12 hours after clipping. We did a fairly thorough development assessment looking at a number of developmental characteristics, starting at postnatal day 6, going to day 16. And we did fairly extensive behavioral tests, as adults. Starting at week 7, the animals were handled, and then, as you can see here on the slide, a number of different behavioral tests, including an open field test, elevated plus maze. Then we did the modified Sherpa. We did a grip test, beam test, and then finally a rotorod test. And then at the end, the animals were euthanized, and we looked at toes for histology. So if we look at the results, so on this graph, on the vertical axis, you'll see the percent of animals exhibiting some of the signs that one could interpret to be distress or pain. And then you'll see the groups along the horizontal axis. Now I want to bring your attention to the postnatal day 17 group. This is the upper age limit that we looked at. Group 1 was toe clipped. Group 3 was a sham control. And you can see there was no observable reaction. Contrast that to the same groups, but at postnatal day 7, there were some signs of vocalization and some limb dragging in group 1. Group 3 recognized at postnatal day 7 was just restraint. It was sham. So just handling the animals at that age was distressful. And this had been seen and been reported in some of the earlier work that was done. What was very interesting, and again, we had historically used topical anesthetic or recommended it, again, to help with respect to animal welfare and pain and distress. But as you can see here, that the reactions to the vapor coolant were significantly greater than no anesthetic at all. So if we want to look at some other characteristics over this time period, the other thing we observed is anytime the vapor coolant was used, there was significant bleeding, probably related to vasodilatation as a response to cooling, where in either case, either age, at 7 or 17, there was none. The staff member, the technician doing this work, found it very difficult to clip the toes at day 7. And when the vapor cooled, and it was not difficult to do it at 17. And in either case, 7 or 17 days of age, anytime the vapor coolant was used, it made it considerably more difficult because the digits would be adhered to one another. And finally, the other post-observational feature, which was swelling. The animals that were clipped at postnatal day 17, there was no impact. There was no abnormalities noted, whereas in the other groups, whether the vapor coolant was used in a sham situation or they were clipped there was some degree of swelling. So continuing, I talked about the developmental tests were done. There were no differences seen between any of the groups. There were no differences seen behaviorally, and I didn't mention this, but we also monitored weight gain, and there were no differences there. The other thing we looked at is how well the digits were innervated at the various ages. Again, and we determined that there was innervation, full innervation at postnatal day 7, which was our earlier time point and the later time point in the earlier studies. And the reality is, by postnatal day 7, at least in B6 mice, much of the diaphysis of the phalanges are already calcified. So the concern about the additional pain cutting through bone did not appear to be relevant. So what was the outcome of this? Obviously, we revised our institutional guidelines and established new procedures. So where we had recommended a vapor coolant before, that was eliminated. We extended our recommended ages to greater than or equal to day 17. And very often, this is done with tail biopsy, and based on other work, the recommended age for that is day 14 to 17 days postnatally. And as I said, I think it's important to publish this work so it can be scrutinized, and that was done. So that was example 1. Example 2. I'm going to take you back to the early 2000s. Most institutions like ours, the technology for creating genetically engineered animals was well established, and most of us our populations of animals were expanding. And the reality is, many of the animals that are generated through this process, or when you're intercrossing, are not a correct genotype, and the animals have to be euthanized because of incorrect genotype. This is a very labor-intensive process. There are few, and at the time, there were few and the solutions that were available were quite imperfect. There were commercial systems, and many people had developed their own systems at home of their own. So what are our desired outcomes for approaching this problem? Most of these are not surprising, and I'm not going to read them, but there were some ones that we either focused on or were additional than what you would expect. So we wanted to minimize the changes in the animal's environment prior to euthanasia or during euthanasia. So we wanted the animals to remain in their home cage. We wanted the process to allow complete visualization of all animals that were going to be euthanized. We wanted to ensure death versus narcosis, because that can be problematic after disposal. And we wanted this to be as efficient as possible from a labor perspective. The reality is, at an institution of our size, we're talking about large numbers of animals, and ideally it would be cost efficient. So what we did was, again, I said we had a highly harmonized program, and we used a single type of ventilated caging system. So working with that manufacturer, we developed a concept in which, rather than bringing room air into this particular rack, using a fairly sophisticated engineering paradigm, we were able to basically replace room air with carbon dioxide and use this as a euthanasia rack. This system involves a series of power-operated dampers, and we have control through a program logic controller of the fans. We have automated solenoid valves to control when gas comes in and when gas doesn't. So to make a long story short, the system was completely validated. We tested it extensively. We did behavioral analysis and selected what we thought was the best cycle to use to humanely euthanize mice. And this allows us to do upwards of 80 cages per cycle. And these animals are in the original cage that they were in their prior holding room, and they're just left there for our staff to perform. So we've been using the system now successfully for over 9 years. We have over 15 of these, and a number of other institutions have purchased these racks, and this work has been published. Now we come forward to 2013 when the AVMA guidelines come forward. So first, let me go over a little bit about how the system works. There are basically 3 phases of process that take place within the rack. There is a phase called during which the gas is released into the environment. So that's the gas fill phase. Then there is a soak phase. And then C would be the time where we purge the gas and we make sure that all animals are euthanized and that they just weren't anesthetized. And if you look here, again, here is a series of CO2 concentration curves from within cages on the rack. But what you'll see, or what I will tell you, is if you look at the rate at which the gas increases, it averages, it's approximately about 65% of the displacement rate per minute. Now, the AVMA guidelines makes 2 recommendations. They make a recommendation under the general carbon dioxide euthanasia recommendations of using a displacement rate from 10 to 30% is recommended. And then specifically with respect to rodents, they say an optimal flow rate for carbon dioxide euthanasia system should displace 10 to 30% of the chamber or cage volume per minute. Now here we have a situation where we've been using a system that we have validated and we feel is appropriate, which does not meet this recommendation. So what do? So we feel we need to go back and we need to reevaluate and look at the standards and determine how our system compares. And we did that. We looked at an individual cage method using the displacement rates that are recommended, the low and the high, recommended by the AVMA. And then we compared that with the automated rack that we've developed. We looked at both mice and rats, and we looked at, I talked about the conditions, and we did a behavioral assessment. There were about 69 cages per condition, and we scored them with a distress score of 1 to 5. This was performed by, or the evaluations were done by experienced staff, either technical staff, veterinary technical staff, or veterinarians. It was done randomized and was completely blinded. And what we saw, again, the distress scores are relatively low, but if we look here on your left is the mouse, and you see the 10%, 30%. These are the recommendations of the AVMA panel. We did a 60% single cage, and here's our automated system. And you can see that it is the lowest of all the distress scores. You'll find even a greater difference here in the rat, where our automated system was yielded lower distress scores. And this information was shared. The manufacturer that was manufacturing these systems and had sold some and had continued to sell some, we had been sharing this information, and we told them that that information could be shared with their other clients who purchased this unit. But the reality is people didn't want to hear that there was a performance standard, and I suggested to him, and he suggested to them, that they do their own evaluations and do their own assessments. But the reality is people don't necessarily want to do that. So, and basically they just wanted to know, is this compliant with the AVMA guidelines? And it wasn't. So we went back. And so you might ask, well, why didn't we just try to at the time, have lower displacement rates? The reality is, and this is outside of my level of expertise, there are laws of physics and gas and engineering restrictions that would not allow us to have a slower displacement rate and allow the gas to be evenly distributed within the rack, or so we thought. But after giving this great thought and looking at what we could do, we decided we could, at the same pressures and the same flow, we could pulse CO2 in. So we were able to go and develop a second program to operate the system, in which the displacement rate was about 22%, so within the guidelines. And then we repeated the study that I had indicated, where we evaluated distress scores, and our conclusion was the same, that our classic, what I call our classic, our published program, still yielded a lower distress score in both mice and rats than what was recommended by the AVMA. So what do we do now? We have both programs on the unit. We use the one that we think is preferred. But we do have the option, if somebody says, well, this is actually an engineering standard in the AVMA guidelines, we would push back, but we would not be using that particular program unless forced to do so. So I said I would talk a little bit about looking forward, and I'm going to editorialize just a little bit. I've been in the field now for over 30 years. Biomedical research is a huge enterprise in this country, and it has led to very valuable and significant improvements to animal welfare, as well as, more importantly, or equally importantly, I should say, human welfare. The amount of funding that has been given to, that has been made available to do the kinds of things, to develop scientific-based standards, is really quite small, and it has gotten worse, not better. So I think it's absolutely essential for us as a community to lobby for extramural funding for the types of work that needs to be done. And the reality is, some of the big questions that have to be addressed, if we're going to do it based on a science or an objective-driven conclusion, it's got to be done as a consortium. It has to do multiple institutions at multiple sites to evaluate. And I use space and cage size as a good example. These sort of one-off studies, that's not going to, in my opinion, is not going to cut it. We really need to do something more global, and this is done in other areas of science. We need to sort of have a consortium approach with money to pay for it. Finally, I'll leave you with what I view as the sort of ideal relationship between performance and engineering standards. You heard this mentioned before. It's a balance. I think we need both, but I think we also have to recognize the relationship between the two. They feed off of one another, and they benefit one another. And with that, I will end. I hopefully are my time. Fairly close.
Thank you, Dr. Lipman. One thing I forgot to mention beforehand, those of you that are online, if you do have questions that arise, please go ahead and submit those now. It will be easier for us to write them down and bring them in than submit them right at the time of the Q&A session. So go ahead, as your questions arise, submit those. All right, so we will move on to our next end user perspective. Our speaker is Dr. Ann Vasbinder. Dr. Vasbinder is the head of corporate 3R's responsibility and training strategy in the Office of Animal Welfare, Ethics, and Strategy at GlaxoSmithKline. Dr. Vasbinder.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts about our dog housing project is what I'm going to present today. When Dave was putting this, the roundtable topics together, I started talking to him about some projects we've been working on, and over the last several years, I've had the pleasure of developing some programs for GSK. So I wanted to share some of our experiences with you. Okay, so I was asked to speak really on industry, and industry is a lot of things. It's not just, it can be several things. It can be big pharma, small pharma, biotech, medical devices, but today I'd like to talk about big pharma really. We're a large multinational company. We have sites all over the globe, and so my perspective will really be very warped towards something very big and kind of globally oriented. What's unique about large pharma, there are several things. One, that we have to answer to multiple regulatory organizations across the globe. We listen to Dr. MacArthur Clark talk about the UK. That's my favorite partner because we have a large center in the UK, as well as China, Belgium, France, Spain. We had Singapore and they're gone. Now we got Switzerland. So it's a very dynamic environment that we're working within. Also, the views on animal welfare are very, very different. Just even in places within the United States, if you went to central Montana against somebody in New York City, they'd have just a very different view on animals in general. I came from a very rural part of the Pacific Northwest from a cattle operation, and I think that really shaped a lot of how I see things, and I've seen a huge evolution in time. So social perspectives as well. What kind of pressures are the societies putting on companies to meet standards that are acceptable to their viewpoint and allow us to continue to have the license to operate within our research paradigms? So it's just within industry, we have a lot of different expectations to kind of manage and respect. So just in thinking about the guide, when we started working on our performance standards, of course, I think all of these words have been brought forward today because these are pulled right out of the guide, but professional judgment, looking at outcomes, it has to be tailored to programs, and realize when you start talking about tailored programs, you have to think about what is maximally flexible for a global organization. So how can we get an outcome that's acceptable to all the programs, and has the flexibility to accommodate what we need, yet has aligned outcomes so that there's a sense of satisfaction that we're doing the right thing for the animals. And so that's the challenge that our programs face when we look at performance challenges. The advantage, like I said, is that there's more than one way to the same end, so trying to get there. But then the downside, as Neil had pointed out, is that there just have to be agreed outcomes, and that's probably one of the hardest things to come to. And so I am a veterinarian, and so I can say this. If you put 5 veterinarians in one room, you will have 5 different opinions about what's good performance. And so actually that's something very hard to put a pin on the map for when it comes to doing the right thing for the animals. Also, a lack of agreement on the desired outcome. It may be that you can go through these exercises, and in the end, about 3 years later, another team of people will come and say, well, it doesn't meet my expectations. So then do you go through this again, or do you just say, these are the expectations we've set, and this is what we're going with? You may not have enough information to really fully create decisions for expectations. And then what are the minimum expectations, which we talked about, and I'll go on a little bit later in my talk about. And then, it is very costly to work through some of these problems in a way that's scientifically justified and acceptable. So I was asked, well, what are the qualities of an acceptable performance standard within your organization? Well, firstly, that it's outcome-based. And, I also head up our strategy for training. And when you want to train somebody, you want to say, what does a well-trained person look like? And then work your way to getting them trained, right? And in this case, it's the same thing. What does your outcome look like? And then how are we going to set up a road that will allow us to get to where we need to go? And I'll give you examples today. It also needs to be based on facts and data. And when there's not facts and data present, then we have used expert advice. And that's also a sticky wicket there, because when you start working with experts, they have very different opinions based on the culture and backgrounds that they've come from as well. You need to be able to measure your success. How did it work out? Are we getting to where we want to go? And then also gain buy-in. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. The range of things that we've looked at within our programs for performance standards, this is not limiting. There's a lot of things that we've done. I guess I thought training was very important. So, you know, it's not limited to what you can accomplish. So the performance standards that we developed for dog housing, I laughed talking to Dr. Goldentire this morning. She said if you start talking about performance standards, 9 out of 10 times dog cage size becomes an issue. Well, in GSK, we developed a little, we recognized the need for performance standards when we had staff that would be visiting across our different sites saying, well, we don't do it this way, we don't do it this way, and we don't do it this way, and we don't think this is big enough, or this is, wow, this is big, or you have more resources than we do. And we started kind of having this comparison, and it became clear that there was a need to understand why and how we did housing for our dogs in our facilities. So the first thing we did was started our a project management plan. I thought I'd just lead you through it based on the project management plan. I would say if you're going to go about developing performance standards, it might be a little bit of a no-brainer, but I wasn't that smart at the time we started. It's a really good idea to set a performance management plan for yourself and just work through that plan. So I'd start by saying that we initiated it by basically describing the scope. What were we going to look at? And in our case, we were only going to look at dog housing. And then we were also, we put together a group of very experienced people within our laboratory animal sciences organization to include technicians, veterinarians, and it was my job to lead it. And in the end, also Dr. Lavon Meunier in our organization helped me, and she's developed quite a few capabilities and behavior, so it became very important. We also came to the realization in looking at scope, so when you initiate a project, you want to look at, you know, what are your business objectives, what is your scope, what are you going to cover? We realized that caging isn't the only thing about a program for dogs, and there was a lot of discussion amongst our veterinarians, and I just had it not about 3 days ago with one of the people in our organization about how he felt that a dog could be crated, but with the appropriate exercise program have an adequate quality of life. And so we've battered around a lot about cage size, but we embraced as a team to look at exercise, socialization, and environmental enrichment as in scope for our program. We identified sponsors who were so incredibly supportive and really opened their wallet and said, okay, you design a cage and we'll build it. And then also we set up a communication plan, which is very, very important, and identified our key stakeholders and made sure that we had a way to communicate with them on a regular basis so that we had buy-in and a sense of general awareness of what was going on with these programs. Because that can actually be a problem if a committee or a team is creating a plan that then they put upon an organization, but they haven't gotten the right buy-in. It doesn't always go that well. So the cages that I'm showing here are examples of what we had in-house and more. For example, in our one site, we had several different types of caging as different phases of buildings had been built. We had the metal tandem caging, and some of our metal caging had doors that would allow them to go between these cages. We had some runs, and in the UK, this is a pilot cage that was done, but I used it because it's easy to kind of give a picture of, but they were plexiglass and had doors. And so one last thing that I haven't done a good job of pointing out in these slides is that we also had caging that had solid floors versus raised floors, which becomes a question when you go between the US and the UK. So let's see. So the next step of our project was to create a plan. So our plan, we did a literature review. We benchmarked with many of the people that are out in the field and learned about what other people were doing for dog housing. We had done some pilot studies with flexible housing options looking, is there any way we could flexibly house mini pigs and dogs. We had tried several different things and came to the realization we needed further expertise with some behaviorists and people experienced with caging. So we gathered some consultants. We had, and we wanted to make sure it was diverse and balanced. So we had a fellow from Canada. We had 2 people from the US and 2 people from the UK. And these were people that had published in the area or were behaviorists with expertise in our species. And we did several things with them. We asked them their opinion. We showed them what we had. And then we asked them to prioritize what they believed would be most valued to a dog in their home environment and the dog housing program in general. And it was interesting because when we asked them to prioritize, we found that they didn't actually prioritize cage size per se as the most important aspect to the dog. They actually prioritized social interaction, so dog-to-dog social interaction, dog-to-human social interaction, the opportunity for exercise, interface with environmental enrichment, and space was only, kind of medium to low. And even from our UK experts, which I was really surprised, they were extremely helpful in giving us advice on really getting a program that would be best for the dog. They gave us a set of recommendations, which we took into consideration when building our kennels. So it's time to build some kennels. And, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention. So these were some outcomes we were looking for. And I'm going to come back to these outcomes in a minute because when you start a project, you might not know exactly what you want. And then when you get done, you're so much smarter than when you started. So I'm just sharing where we could have done better. We wanted increased visibility for the animals. We had heard that that was a desired feature of caging, and the gray literature was telling us that dogs don't bark very much when they have a high level of visibility. We wanted softer look to the cage, especially the European contingent felt strongly about the use of even wood and plastics to help soften the looks and the feel of the cage. We wanted to group house for sure. It needed to be accommodating several dogs. We were thinking, we did some studies that were unpublished where we put dogs together and found that when you get to about 6 dogs, and they're male housed dogs, the females aren't an issue, but with the males, if you get more than 6 dogs, you get fights. And so we're looking at kind of between 4 and 6 dogs per cage. Trying to minimize visual barriers. What we did know, I'll show you on the next slide, the ability to change gait in the cage. That was a recommendation from one of the behaviorists. We said, how big is a cage that's big enough? And they said, well, we feel strongly that a dog should be able to perform normal movements. Okay, so what's a normal movement then? Normal movement to them was an animal was able to trot within that cage environment. Okay. We wanted to optimize interaction with the staff. We believe it's very important for the dogs to have time with the staff, especially in acclimation to the environment, and easily sanitizable, and realizing that when you start making these changes for the dogs, you also make the changes for the staff. And so looking at the effect of it on the holistic program was also important. We looked at our exercise programs across all of our global programs. We decided that we wanted a dedicated area outside of the kennel and the room for exercise, because an option would be that dogs could exercise within the room when you're cleaning the pens, and we actually wanted a dedicated space. We wanted access to complexity. We wanted the dogs to be able to climb on things, to interact with toys, and then social interaction with people and other animals, enough space to run, and we wanted to come up with an exercise frequency. And ultimately, we just talked about it and came to 15 minutes. And that was actually based on what is a performance standard, that when the staff let the dogs out, by 15 minutes, all the dogs are laying on the floor or interacting socially. They're actually exercising. And so we had a sense that was the performance standard we set for ourselves. This is what we saw, and this is why we're doing it. We also talked about dog acclimation to the environment when you bring the animals in. How do you do that? There are some very important things that we're doing in regard to introducing an alpha male in every cage, and then introducing dogs in an observed way. And there's a set of behaviors that they display when they do that. Right now, there's work being done in our company to kind of describe that. but also that dogs are conditioned to the study. And our staff in the UK, it's unbelievable what those people do to train these dogs to study. The dogs actually jump up on the table. They're so excited to be in the study environment. And they're really a lot like a working dog. They know what is going to happen, and the training programs that they've developed, they're really unbelievable. So that was our plan. Those were our outcome-based, our aspired outcomes, and that was it was a collaboration of our team of people that worked with dogs and said, this is what I don't like about this, so this is what we're going to do. So these are the cages that we developed. They are, okay, so a few things about them. The bars are horizontal because the visibility, if you have bars that are lined up like this, it creates a visual line, a barrier. And so there's a lot more visibility there. We added plexiglass on the doors, and these doors move back, so you could actually hook all these cages together if you chose to. This is a Dutch door, so like when you were a kid in the 70s, they were really popular in your kitchen. You'd have like a half door and you could open the door. But I love these things because this is how you get to pet a dog without having them all piling out of the cage while you're trying to interact with one dog. This is we call this the patio. It's a front bench, and the dogs do spend quite a bit of time out here, and it's bumped out about 8 inches into the alleyway so dogs can sit here and look down this alleyway. There's also a bench in the back that's is up, and it has a little better visibility. We aspired to soft beds for them to sleep in. And as an after-action review, this is like a ramp, but the ramp wasn't a very good idea. We replaced that with a lower bench, so they jump up on the lower bench and then they jump onto the higher bench, and they do use them, and they can actually see. And we chose this flooring, and the reason that we chose the flooring, it has some grit to it, but the health of the dogs in our sites where we used this particular flooring was very, they had really pink, beautiful feet, and we didn't have many issues with interdigital cysts, so I still really like this flooring. But to be honest with you, just recently we had a fellow come in from the UK who's a behaviorist working with our primate programs, and he was questioning me about this flooring, and I still like it, and he still doesn't. And I mean, that's okay, right? It's just, it's a difference in opinion. So these are just a few more views. The Dutch door, this is how you can actually pet them, hug them, give them medicines, give them a treat. These are dogs that are running back and forth within joined pens, but you can separate them. And you have to be very careful because some of these dogs socially don't belong together. And so it takes staff time to get them introduced. And it's probably a lot like the rodents scenario where I think Pat was talking about when they're introduced young. It makes a big difference. And I think this is an area where we can work with our vendors and get much better social opportunities in any species, whether it's primates, dogs, rodents, cats, God help us. And there's just another view of the whole door open. So this is the exercise area we've developed in Philadelphia. There are equivalents, if not even more Disneyland-like environments for the dogs in the UK. And so we tried to create complexities. They do love to be up. And in RTP at our site in Research Triangle Park, I did some work looking at how we could house our dogs in rooms just as groups of animals, and then they'd only be separated during feeding time and sleeping time. And then created like a ramp that they could sit up on these things. And I mean, if you guys think about like the pit bull in back part of Durham, you know, you think about them, they're on top of their cage looking out over their environment. And I think that's a true behavior, that dogs like to be up. This is an example of us introducing a new dog. There's an alpha male. The alpha male was this one actually. And there was just one new dog, but this is the process where they're introducing the dogs and, you know, assessing their acceptability to that social environment. And then the one thing that I didn't mention was that in the exercise areas and the caging areas, the dogs need an opportunity to escape social contact, and that's one other desirable attribute of the caging that we work towards, so that, you know, if you had a shy dog or a dog that was not particularly social, they'd have a place to escape that social environment. So that was our execution of the project. So we went about monitoring it and really, you know, saying, okay, what do we like about this? What would we do differently the next time? And collected information. The information that we collected were things like, performance of the caging, the dog's behavior in the cage, the time they spent interacting, if they were fitting in socially or not. So there were a lot of things about the kennels that we measured. But we also measured other, dominance and submissive behaviors, aggression. We did look at health. We looked at interdigital cysts. We looked at feeding behaviors. We looked at usage of the different cage functions. We also measured, and this was Levon's team now, I don't take credit for this. We also measured other things like the manpower. The morale was an important part of this project. We found our staff to be very happy with this process. While it did take them a little more time, they enjoyed the process of interacting with the animals more. There were some problems that we had to re-engineer on the cages. They weren't huge problems, I have to be honest with you, but they required our attention. We did monitor stereotypic behaviors as well. We looked at the frequency, and that did go down. And then they're implementing the kind of alpha male cage scenario so that they can improve the social interactions on the male dogs. So if I were to review this project, I think that these performance standards were very good. I mean, we've had a very positive outcome from this project. But if I were to go back and look at this, I can tell you that there was so little literature. It was really surprising. I mean, considering this is man's best friend, there's nothing published out there. And I think there was a little burst before the exercise requirements were published by the USDA in dog exercise, but really describing what is good exercise for a dog with hard data as to why would be really useful. So, why do we want increased visibility? That we didn't have good data. We had the experts telling us it was the right thing to do, which a lot of white papers are based on expertise and not facts and data, which is appropriate, being as that's all we've got to go on. But what you would know, and we tried to measure this, but we had some failings in the measurement process, is that with increased visibility, the dogs don't bark very much because they can see each other. So being in touch is a much easier thing to do for them. So this significantly improved the environment for the technicians because it's just quiet when you walk in these dog rooms. Softer look to the cage. How is this advantageous to the dog? The experts did say, we think this is a good thing for monkeys and dogs. And, but why? I know it does make it quieter when they do bark because the metal has a vibratory kind of nature, but why? Opportunity for social housing. There was some literature about that, and also interaction with staff. There's a lot of information about that. The ability to change gait, we did accommodate that, and I think it's a good thing. And it was based on a behaviorist recommendations. But there was some common sense determinations, much like the performance standards we've been talking about. Is common sense an acceptable rationale for making a decision for performance standards? I think it is, as long as you can agree. Access to complexity. Some of it's just common sense, enough space to run. I mean, I know you all can think about when you go home, you open the door and your dog's waiting for you anxiously. So they go to the door and you let them out and they use the bathroom. And then many young dogs will run around your yard just to take off that energy. We know that. That's not a study. It's not facts and data, but we know this is true. And that's true of what our research dogs do too. So, just thinking about how could I would aspire to better outcomes, to have better described my outcomes when we started this project. But again, hindsight's 20/20. I wish I had known. So at GSK, we have a set of core principles, and it is actually our policy for care and use of animals at GSK. And, these core principles are really basic. Things like the animals will have access to food and water. They'll have access to species-specific housing, including appropriate temperature and humidity, access to human care, and program of veterinary care. So for us within GSK, I think that we understand what we want for our dogs, and we're very comfortable with the parameters we've set for ourselves. And we aspire to doing better every day for the dogs, for animal welfare, for our science, and for the people that are involved with caring for animals too. But when you step outside of GSK, about 30% of our studies right now are done outside of GSK, and I would suggest that with the shrinking size of our company, potentially more outsourcing will occur. And so you start to step into that performance standard area where you say, okay, we want to have performance standard areas, but what is the absolute bottom line for this? And that's where you need engineering standards. And you know, especially when you start working in countries where there aren't well-described animal laws, and there hasn't been a lot of structure or guidance given or thought really to the use of animals in research. And so I would say that, you know, when we're in the United States, when they're ALAC accredited, we have some knowledge of what a institution is doing. But when you step outside, you can get into these shades of gray that really make you question. And a great example of this would be, okay, so I went to one institution in a third world country once, and the fellow was telling me about his really great science, because it was. And I was looking at his desk, and he was drinking a bottle of water. I said, oh, hey, do you not drink the water, municipal water? And he goes, no one drinks the municipal water. And I said, okay, well, what are you giving the animals? Oh, they're fed municipal water. So, you know, the question is, so the answer to that would be a performance standard, that your water quality must be tested, and you must know the range of acceptable tolerances for what you're going to have in your program, right? So GSK right now, we're really in the process of kind of understanding our partners in science, and actually, believe it or not, in regard to the water example, we had a very similar experience in a company within the United States. So it's not just outside of our country, it's all around us that we need to be aware of what people are doing on our behalf. Like I said, ALAC I think is so helpful because it does give us a benchmarking. I mean, we know that there's an aspiration to have quality programs, and we also know that there are baseline standards that are set by the guide. And I can say that the guide is providing a lot of guidance for our team that's working on describing these core principles for our company, and also the EU directive and other, and of course we're a British company, and so we have all of our UK Home Office information, and then also looking at other countries that have very rigorous performance standards like Canada, Singapore, and it's a global company, so we need to think of all of the possible opportunities. So what's in our future? Our future challenges are this, that we don't have the data that we need to make really good decisions at times. And so for us in GSK, right now we're working on looking at and characterizing what is good exercise for a dog through behavioral studies. And like I said, my partner is Lavon Meunier, and she's working on publishing this information. And hopefully we'll have it out there because there's just a lack of dog data. Our outsourced studies are occurring at an increasing rate. So how do we appropriately set our expectations as a company and feel assured that the quality of our science and the animal welfare aspects are upheld? Also, you know, the continued pressure to provide a performance standard and engineering standard, and when you think about that from a British company, that looks like the EU directive, and you know, adapting by default the EU directive because it's just easier for people to understand what we would want of them. But by the same token, the cost and the flexibility is lost when you go to those types of standards. And then lastly, really still battling it out with cultural perceptions, and just even, I think sometimes that that we could have exchange of staff between the sites, and whether it was, you know, China, Belgium, any of the sites would say, we don't do it this way, so it's not our way. So these are the challenges for GSK for future work in performance standards.
All right, thank you, Dr. Vasbinder. So our next speaker is going to be the one of two where we kind of step outside of the box of our controlled institutional environments, where we have the ability to control a lot of what's going on from the standpoint of you know, their housing and that, and we're going to go out to the areas where we don't have that control, and how difficult the challenges, I guess, that presents from the standpoint of developing performance standards. So our next speaker is Dr. John Bryan. Dr. Bryan is a wildlife veterinarian and public service assistant at the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study, affiliated with the University of Georgia. Dr. Bryan?
Can everyone hear me okay? If I step away from the position to mic, it still works? Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank ILAR for inviting me to come and participate. As I was sharing with Dr. Turner earlier before we broke for lunch or shortly thereafter, I'm very grateful for this opportunity because wildlife tends to be viewed as a little bit outside the fray, as David just shared. But we are inherently involved in welfare issues. There is a lot of wildlife research that's going on out there. It's not as if it's not happening. It's not all kind of National Geographic stuff. There's bona fide, really good research out there, the focus of which tends to perhaps stray a little bit farther from the norm of, say, biomedical research. For instance, a lot of wildlife research is done for the sake of wildlife, not using animals as a human model. So I'm not going to touch too much on that today about the differences per se. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we develop performance standards in wildlife animal research and give a short example at the end and talk a little bit about how we apply this stuff. It's a little bit different. So I'm going to emphasize some of those connections, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the methodology that we use to develop performance standards. You'll see that some of it can be quite kind of flexible, which is the word of the day, can be ad hoc, but is firmly based in some very sound principles. And those sound principles are usually based in experience. And to a certain extent in the wildlife realm, these can almost be interpreted as our engineering standards. We've heard a lot of talk today about ventilation, cage size, nutrition programs, enrichment. Do you immediately see those as things that we can control in a wildlife research context? No. Okay. And just as an aside for my own edification, is there anyone, or how many folks here in the room have actually conducted wildlife research? Not zoo work, but gone into the wild to do research on animals in their natural habitat? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, good. So there's some folks out there. All right. And a lot of these quote unquote kind of developed or experience-based engineering standards that we have are kind of based in things that stem from the 3 R's. And we'll see how that models a little bit. Reduction in numbers, refinement in technique. Replacement is not so much of an issue. As I said before, sometimes we're studying a certain species because we want to know about that particular species. Replacing it with another would be unacceptable in a scientific context. So I shall move on. And I realize fully that I'm speaking kind of in the horse latitudes of public speaking between 2 and 3 o'clock. So I usually keep some pictures on every slide to try and keep things rolling. I'm not going to talk too much about the pictures. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. No worries there. So a little bit of a table of contents about what we're going to talk about today. Obviously, performance standards are the focus of the day. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Performance standard definitions as they relate to wildlife research. And these are the tools mainly for how we develop performance standards in wildlife. This one is huge. This one is big. This one's slightly less, and this one is, well, it can be ginormous or it can be kind of not that needed. And then how do we develop these and how do we recognize them? And finally, we'll wrap it up with an example. All right, so a little bit of a brief word. We've gone over this definition today. The only thing I want to say about it is that as a wildlife veterinarian, I really like it. I think it fits very nicely with the performance standards that we have in wildlife veterinary medicine. And one of the reasons is this word right here, discretion, in the context of this one and a desired outcome. The fact that we're all working toward a desired outcome, which I tend to interpret as compliance with either AWAR or OLA, whichever it may be, I think that ties us together with biomedical research. We're all looking for the best possible standards we can have, whether it be wildlife, whether it be biomedical research. We want to have standards that reflect our beliefs and our values as a civilized society conducting research on animals. And then professional input, sound judgment, and team approach. In wildlife, I think maybe you may not take this away, so I'm going to go ahead and say it right now. Each project that a wildlife Aia Code or body such reviews will often be very different than the one underneath it on the stack or the one that came before it. And so you almost have to wipe the slate clean every time you read a submission if you're on a wildlife Aia Code, and start again de novo with each project. Why? Because species change, climate change, terrain changes, seasons change, seasons affect drugs, seasons affect reproduction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're OLAW and dealing with basically occupational health, then you have issues about being out in the field with your team, your experience. The list goes on and on and on, and it can change 10 or 11 times in a day if you're a reviewer. All right, so performance. I just wanted to parse this definition out because I like it so much. So as a quick breakdown, basically pertains to project review and oversight. That's how I'm going to take it today. So imagine that to a certain extent you're a member of an Aia Code that does 80 to 90%, 100% wildlife oversight. We're going to walk through this and keep your mind kind of wrapped around that as we move. So performance standard, a standard or a guideline, describes a desired outcome, which we're going to blanketly interpret as compliance. And then flexibility in achieving that desired outcome, and this is what I love, this discretionary authority. That is the crux of any wildlife Aia Code right there. That is it. And I've kind of got two kind of just throw at you definitions. One of them is the obligatory American Heritage College Dictionary. This one, however, I dug up through some crusty old archives from an advisory commission on intergovernmental relations. I apologize if anybody was on that back then, and I'm using your definition. But when answering questions of years past about what it's like to be on an Aia Code for the uninitiated, those people who are perhaps in veterinary medicine or perhaps medicine who don't really understand this animal welfare issue, they would say, what is this Aia Code? What is it analogous to? One of the ways I used to explain this is that each Aia Code is kind of like a Supreme Court, and it interprets the resources out there, the Animal Welfare Act, OLAW, et cetera, in its own way. No two Aia Codes are the same. They're all going to come out with different interpretations. Usually that's based on the experience of the committee members and a lot of the project that comes in through the submissions. So, power of a local government, an Aia Code, an entity to conduct its own affairs. And if you're a wildlife Aia Code, that is what you do, this is how you do it, and this is what you need. All right, so discretionary authority. Who gets this if you're a wildlife Aia Code? Who is granted this discretionary authority? Well, as it says in the definition, the ACUP managers, certainly the Aia Codes, and the PIs. And I like this part of the definition because we're going to talk a little bit about consulting and resources in terms of doing wildlife Aia Code review. And a lot of people think that, well, you can't ask the PI because that's the person under review. You can't ask a PI, is what you're doing best practices? Is this the best way to do it? Well, of course the PI is going to say yes. They want approval. They want to get on with their work. But I think you'll find, and this really isn't that much of a surprise for this audience to hear this, but PIs can be a fantastic resource to seek clarity and to have judgment and approval on projects that were made in good faith with informed decision-making by the Aia Code members. And so performance standards development requires, as we've seen before in previous talks, professional input, sound judgment, and a team approach. These are also the cornerstones of working on any wildlife Aia Code. All right, so performance standards, design. How do you design a performance standard in the wildlife research context? Do they happen de novo? Sure, yeah. As we saw in the previous presentation, sometimes it's based on what you see before you, And there are also resources that some are a little bit more set in stone, like the Animal Welfare Act or OLAW, and then others are a little bit extraneous. Maybe off the beaten path, published resources, experience, and then application, implementation, and monitoring, best practice tools employed in the assessment of animal use activities. Specifically, why? That's our goal, to ensure compliance with the relevant law and/or policy. And the whole point of this, obviously to keep the 36,000-foot perspective, is to achieve the desired outcome, which is, we're interpreting for brevity, compliance. So, what traditional resources do we have to develop professional standards, performance standards, in a wildlife Aia Code context? Well, the traditional stuff is the Animal Welfare Act and its resources and the guide, and we've heard some other sources mentioned today, but these are the published sources with which we begin. These are our foundational documents in this country. No surprise there. So, but are those enough? Are those complete? If you are conducting wildlife research, is this all you need? Is this half of what you need? Is it a quarter of what you need? Is it a tenth? Is it a fifth? We'll look at that. What other resources exist if this is not all you need? What else is out there? And how do you use that? How does that fit into the dynamic? Okay, so let's look a little bit at the Animal Welfare Act. There's a lot in the Animal Welfare Act about how to conduct biomedical research. We've seen cage dimensions, we've talked about enrichment, all this kind of stuff. What about wildlife? Well, unofficially, there's this term that we call, in the parlance of our times, the field study exemptions. Basically, this is from the definition, section 1.1. We all know this. If you're dealing with wildlife, if it fits under the jurisdiction of the Aia Code, in other words, if a project requires review and oversight by an Aia Code, one of the first metrics you're going to run that project through is whether it involves invasive procedures, harms, or material alteration of the behavior of the animals under study. Does anybody have any definitions for these? Can anybody give me definitions for these three? There's some pretty good parameters out there that touch upon it, but no, I'd be surprised. And then we move on down to section 2.31, which also define and lay out some duties of the Aia Code. So once again, here we see the field study exemptions in play. All right, inspect at least once every 6 months. We've heard about that. But if you fit the field study exemptions, you don't have to do that project. That's not included. And review of activities involving animals. However, field studies, as defined in section 1 on the previous slide, once again, exempt. That's a pretty powerful exemption. Basically, these statements say that if you are not harming and not involving invasive procedures and you don't have projects that materially alter the behavior of the animal under study, then you don't have to go through review. You don't have to have Aia Code oversight. That's an enormous exemption. And the precedent out there for a long time was that wildlife, by definition, fit this. That whatever you did to a wildlife species, there's no way you could harm it. There were no parameters or metrics to measure invasive procedures. And material alteration of behavior, really? How do you put a metric to that in terms of wildlife? Now, but before I curse the darkness, I'll light a candle and say that when the Animal Welfare Act was written in 1966, or prior to that, actually, that's when it was passed, it was amazing that they even considered this much in terms of wildlife. I'll give them credit. To have the foresight to even throw the exemptions in there was quite impressive. So we'll not bash the Animal Welfare Act for that. At least it says something. So, and then the guide. There's more, I appreciate, especially the paragraph immediately prior to this, which also references extraneous pursuit or pursuit of extraneous resources to figure out how best to do oversight. So, in both the Animal Welfare Act and regulations and the guide, there is some language. It's not void. It's not as if there's nothing there. But, once again, I'll refer you back to a couple of slides prior. Is this enough? Is this enough? We'll take a look at that, like I said. So these are some other resources. Professional societies. A long time ago, it was known that wildlife research was happening. It's not as if it just popped out of the sky yesterday. And in pursuit of setting standards for the way that these activities are conducted, professional resources and professional societies sprung up to make standards for some of these activities. Are these comprehensive? Are these enough? Are these in conjunction with the previous two? Is your set of references and resources to have perfect oversight for wildlife activities complete if these three plus the previous two, if that's your library? Is that it? Is that good enough? It depends. Usually no. But these are non-traditional resources that wildlife researchers and members of wildlife Aia Cooks use to generate informed decisions to assess and evaluate wildlife activities conducted in research. All right. So this is one of the most important terms in performance standards in terms of wildlife research. Flexible performance standards are to be created by discretionary authority, obviously using professional input, sound judgment, and a team approach. We've heard a lot about that today for the desired outcome. How is this achieved in wildlife? Is it different than in the laboratory? If so, how and why? Well, I think we've already answered those questions. There are established traditional resources that are available and some somewhat non-traditional resources that are still kind of hardcover versions of these. But what else is out there? What else makes our toolkit complete for wildlife research oversight? Well, we're going to look at some of those. All right. These are the things that wildlife Aia Cooks, the PIs, the Aia Cook members and oversight people, these are your main tools. These are the tools. Once you've established that you're causing harm, there perhaps is an invasive procedure, and you're materially altering the animals under study, these are the next things that you go to evaluate activities. Ecology, knowing the environment, the climate, the season, physiology. I spoke a little bit more about this. When I was chair of the National Park Service Aia Cook, I used to get calls a lot from researchers in the field saying, I'm going to do an activity in a certain park, and the head permitting officer there told me to give you a call and talk to you about whether or not I needed Aia Cook approval for my project. And oftentimes the PI would say, well, I don't really think I need Aia Cook approval for my project because I'm misnetting. I've never had to have misnetting reviewed before. Well, I would say, my next question would be like, okay, all right. What species are you misnetting? What time of year are you misnetting? What is the terrain like? Are you misnetting bats? Are you misnetting birds? Oops. What are the specific details of your project? And then the PI would think, well, maybe that is a little bit different. Is it a lethal capture? What kinds of samples are you collecting from these animals once you have them in hand? These are some of the things to think about in terms of climate. Let's see, in terms of climate and season, these are some of the really important questions. Can anybody tell me why it's not a good idea to conduct wolf research in the summer? What's the first easiest reason why that's not a good idea? You can't find them. There's no snow. All right? Usually snow is one of the most important things to help find these animals. Second of all, they're probably going to be whelping. It's not something you want to interfere with. Is it a good idea to do elk work in the winter? January, February, March. Is that a good time to do elk work, service elk? Actually, that's the best time to do it. That's one of the best times to do it for a lot of reasons. First of which is when you're dealing with elk, you're going to have to chemically immobilize them. The weather helps you out tremendously. All right, an elk on carfentanil down in July and August is very risky. All right. Let's see, physiology. We talked a little bit about that. Let's say that you're on a wildlife Aia Cook and a PI submits to you a project about chemically immobilizing and tagging grizzly bears in February. What's the problem with that? They're hibernating, yeah. I mean, den entry studies are done. That's not uncommon. But for that would be a little bit different. Physiology, let's stick with the bears for a second. Let's say that you have one PI who says, right when bears emerge, I'm going to dart them and collar them. And the first PI who does his project in March, April, says, I'm going to primarily go for a shoulder shot on the dart, whereas the other PI, who's also doing bears, is going to do it in October. And he says, well, we're going to do shoulder and hip. Are they both correct? Which one's kind of a little off? Which one requires a little scrutiny, a little nudging in the right direction? What's going on with bears in February, March when they emerge? Are they fat? Are they skinny? They're very skinny. Where is their extra tissue to receive a dart? In the rump. You wouldn't want to dart a bear in emergence in the shoulder. That's a risky shot. So when a PI comes in and says something like, yeah, we're going to do shoulder shots in March, you might want to think, okay, this is a chance to apply a performance standard. This is a chance to say to the PI, I don't know what your history is with that. Perhaps you could share it with us. Hopefully you haven't had too many thoracic shots with that, and we'd like you to maybe move your dart placement to the rear end of the animal rather than at the front for that time of year. Fall, you can go either way. Okay. These are other performance standards when you're on a wildlife Aia Code. Experience. Who's done this? I can't tell you how many times on a wildlife Aia Code we would get projects and no one on the committee had ever conducted anything like it. Sometimes one or two committee members had, sometimes none. So what do you do then? Where do you find the experience needed to make an assessment for a project like that that's totally foreign? Well, consultation with colleagues, with other professionals, and populating your Aia Code with a wide variety of people who've conducted a number of different types of wildlife issues is very advantageous. And this is another way that you gain experience. All right, flexibility, contingencies. As Donald Rumsfeld said, I believe one time, you know, you've got your knowns, your known unknowns, and your unknown unknowns. Flexibility is a way to kind of blanketly address and try as best you can to prepare for things that you don't know are coming. Flexibility. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then ingenuity, quick responses on the fly. All right. So ecology. You cannot underestimate this enough, and I think I've shot a few examples at you to try and stress how important this is. Knowing the ecology of the projects that you're seeing, in which you're participating, this is the very cornerstone of assessing wildlife activities. Where is it happening? What time of year is it happening? What species are involved in? Not just the target species, but the species around it. When I talk to colleagues or friends about being a wildlife veterinarian, I like to kind of sometimes say that being a wildlife veterinarian, which is 100% wildlife veterinarian, which is what I am much more akin to an ecologist than I am to folks who wear the white coats and do the hard work in neighborhoods vaccinating dogs and cats. You cannot take any project in terms of wildlife research in a vacuum, in isolation like that. You have to think of the ecology of the project. If you're working with predators, are you going to affect territoriality of predators? Wolves are extremely territorial. If you go out and have everything right about a wolf project, drugs, capture, handling, everything, time of year, what if you get a hold of a wolf and your workup station where you finally got it is feet away from a traditional territory from a rival pack? Your situation with recovering that animal just got infinitely much more complicated in terms of personnel staying in the area, in terms of the safety of that study animal. You have to account for these contingencies. You must know the ecology. You must know the species. Environment, tropical, temperate, Arctic, marine, mountainous, we've gotten all of these projects. Altitude issues, people wanting to do mountain goat studies. Has the team ever been above 7,000 feet? They might be darting mountain goats at 12,000. And the PI would write, nobody's ever been up that high before. We're leaving tomorrow. Really? All right. Climate, precipitation. Perhaps you may have to deal with incessant rainfall, snowfall, dry, droughts. Season, winter, spring, we've touched on that. The physiology of animals' ways, reproduction, animals in rut, different territorialities, whelping, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that play in. Physiology of animals, the bear is a great example of that, their hibernation, weight gain, Migration, animals might not be where you think they are by the time the PI gets there. Reproduction, hibernation, age, and sex, and all these things can be expressed in one project. And that's one aspect of one performance standard of one project. So take all that, mix and stir, and now we'll move on to the next performance standard once that's in your pocket. Experience. Who out there has done this stuff? What do we know about this kind of work, this kind of activity? I tend to think about it in terms of you've got committee experience and then you've got individual experience. On the committee, when I was chair of the Park Service Aia Code, what I liked to do was build a workable library, an archive which we could access. Once again, you kind of go back to the court analogy. You know, a lot of Supreme Court decisions and district court decisions are based on precedent. So you can go back into your archive if you're not sure exactly what you're reading and look at your archive. Has this committee ever seen anything like this before? How did we decide this? What kind of amendments, what kind of alterations, clarifications did we seek on this? Who was the PI? Has the technique been refined since then? How did we decide what we decided on this project? What does our own archive say? And then individual experience, literally, who on the committee has done this type of work? And if not, do we have a colleague at an institution or somewhere else who's done this type of work? Can we bring them in for a consultation on review of this project? Experience, very important. Next performance standard that we use, flexibility. The flexibility that you build into wildlife Aia Code oversight has to be, or should be, minimally as dynamic as the project itself. Inflexibility and oversight in wildlife basically begs catastrophe. I really can't say that enough. We talked a little bit earlier in terms of the biomedical world about engineering standards, you know, cage dimensions and these types of things. It's very hard to apply strict standards to wildlife, mainly because of what we saw earlier, different climates, different species, multiple species within ecosystems. You can't blanket this kind of stuff over every single project. They vary. There is inherent complexity and dynamic change in each of these projects, in each of these activities. And flexibility needs to be a little bit predictive. Flexible, when most people think of flexible, perhaps you think of an idea of being able to react. Well, there needs to be some flexibility built in to give yourself some room to react in the future. Even though you may not know, like we said before, the unknown unknowns. Build in flexibility to the oversight process. And it has to be informed, obviously based on the two biggies, ecology and experience. And then ingenuity, all right? Flexibility applied is what I like to call ingenuity. All right, it should be predictive. Whereas flexibility can be predictive, it may not have to be. Ingenuity should be predictive, and it's obviously based on ecology and experience. It's adaptive and repeatedly so. If you think that you can leave yourself enough wiggle room in oversight of projects and you do have a significant change or something comes along, a curveball comes along from the field, and you can counter it and address it perhaps with an amendment, perhaps with a clarification, that may not be the only one. Field season's not over. There would be multiple, perhaps. Be lucky if there was just one change from the field. And then responsive, amendments on the fly. So I'm going to give a little bit of an example and talk about how we put a few of these things into action. So there was a desert bighorn sheep project a few years ago. Obviously, I'm not going to go into detail. None of this is published yet, so we're going to be very broad, and I've mixed a few projects in together. So please don't think of this as one project. This project came across our desk at the Park Service Aia Code. We immediately identified it as an extremely challenging project in terms of the environment, the terrain, the climate, the species, the capture techniques, the handling, the team, everything. So what are the first things we did? Well, the first thing we can do is do a full committee review right out because we need to have as many eyes on this thing as possible. That has to do with our ecology, knowing our ecology, and knowing our experience. The next thing we do is look at flexibility and ingenuity. Obviously, we know these performance standards were going to be in high demand for this project and its oversight. So all of our aspects of performance standards are going to be in play while we review this project, follow it, monitor it, and have our oversight. So what happened? So performance standards at work, project review. Obviously, we immediately appreciated as potentially, and I say furiously dynamic. There was potential for almost radical change in this project at a moment's notice. But it was very important work. There were multiple PIs and stakeholders, and it needed to go forward. But we needed to get it right, and we needed to know that we were going to be in touch with the PI and stay with the process as it went, keeping our flexibility and keeping, hopefully, our ingenuity, and trusting that our knowledge of the ecology and our experience could see us through that. So the recognized need for built-in flexibility, and that included making prioritized contingencies and keeping quick communication, heavy on experience of Aia Code membership and professional consultation. So we tried to prepare ourselves through these performance standards on the outset. So in the field, what happened? Surprise, surprise. The PI calls from the field. He says, plan A is not working. We got to go to plan B. We had plan B. We had discussed this with the PI. It was all laid out. It was definitely a significant change, a change in capture technique, change in pharmacology, a little bit of personnel issue, obviously a significant change. We needed an amendment. So how do we respond to that? We'd already recognized this project as highly volatile and definitely open to drastic change in the field. So all the committee members during field season for this project were on call. And they knew that during the time that this PI was in the field with this project, that they could possibly get a call to discuss changes that needed to be amended to this project. So, sure enough, the call came. The committee members were prepared. We called them all. Members were all reached. A real-time discussion took place, conference call with the PI in the field via satellite phone. Conversation went on for about 30, 40 minutes discussing exactly what was going to get done, how it matched up with the contingencies that we'd approved as a committee during the initial review. And the amendment was passed in real time, recorded, and filed in a project folder in the committee archive. Good to go. We may have had to have done this the next day again, but we didn't. We lucked out with this one. This was the only change that happened in this project. So performance standards at work. How did we set ourselves up to make this performance standard work to our benefit, to the PI's benefit, to science's benefit? So obviously during the review of this project, the PI shared with us how crazy this could be. And so we responded as an Aia Code, basically that it would be prudent to set us up to be as flexible as we possibly could by grounding that flexibility and knowing our ecology and having the experience about this species and this work. So the reviewing Aia Code members for this project knew that this might change midstream, and we prepared ourselves for it. And we knew that the contingencies were going to be acceptable because we knew the species, we knew the environment, the PI, the drugs, the seasonal conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And moreover, and I like this one, when we started the Park Service Aia Code, writing our SOP, with a bunch of help from the USDA, by the way, we knew that we were all wildlife people coming into this, and we knew that wildlife can be chaos. And so we tried to build into our SOP this kind of response, not really knowing exactly what it would look like, but building into it flexibility to where we could respond to this type of dynamic change, but still achieve compliance and still follow the rules. So these were our broad performance standards that we didn't even know they were performance standards while we were writing them, but they turned out to be very valuable. So we had written this kind of ad hoc response, committee members on call, sat phones with the PIs, calling from the field, real-time discussion and amendments, that kind of stuff. We had written that into our SOP. We weren't doing anything that had not been laid forth in our language, which goes back to our discretionary authority. We are that little entity that's in control of its own little fiefdom. So we set ourselves up on good footing to respond to these types of things. And then such experience, flexibility, ingenuity, absolutely are hallmarks of any wildlife Aia Code performance standards. No way around it. Rigid standards in assessing wildlife projects will frustrate you to no end. And like I said in a previous slide, it will beg catastrophe. So generally kind of a quick thought perspective, the definition of performance standards as written in the guide, I think fit very well with wildlife Aia Code oversight. They allow for that skeletal framework of discretionary authority and then the flexibility to carry out and address the needs of the PIs and the Aia Code and the institution that it serves to stay within compliance, to play by the rules, and uphold these standards while having that flexibility. And then there are some details of wildlife project oversight that are a little bit different than what we think of as traditional resource guidelines. And those are important, and those need to be emphasized. But we're in a dialogue here. We're in a dynamic conversation about how wildlife fits in to these performance standards of our overall welfare efforts here in this country. And I think that this is very good footing on which we can all start. And I think it fits very well, and I'm very grateful for ILR to have invited me here today. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bryan, for that. That was really a great, interesting talk. All right, we are set to take a break. We are still going to stick with a 15-minute break. So let's come back at 5 till, and we'll get started with our last session of end users.